So if I start and run this engine and I take my battery switch and I move it to the all position or the both position or the 1 and 2 position with the engine running, nothing is going to happen. But that doesn't mean that you should be doing this. Now, if I were to take this switch and I were to change it down to the off position, that is going to be a big problem, and I'm going to explain exactly what is going on with both of these situations so that way you understand completely what is happening with your battery switch and how your charging system works on your engine. So this is the engine that we're going to be doing an example on, because you need to understand the engine before we talk about the battery switch. This engine here has a pull start to it, so we can pull start this and it can run without a battery. That is important to understand, because whenever you start this engine, the stator starts producing electricity, and as it produces electricity, the engine uses that electricity to run itself. It uses that to ignite your ignition coils and everything else. So it's just like on a bigger engine. If you start and run your engine, the ECM is going to be consuming electricity. Let's say it's 1 amp. The fuel pump is going to consume, let's say, 2.5 amps. Your ignition system, being your coils and to create spark, that's going to be consuming, let's give it another 2 amps, 2.5 amps. Let's say as the engine is running with all its components, being the computer, the fuel pump, your coils, and all the other electronics that are on the engine, let's say that it's consuming 6 amps of power. The electricity coming from your stator or your alternator is going to be producing, let's say, 20 amps at idle. Now, it's consuming 6, which means it has 14 amps that it is putting out to charge your battery. When you start the engine, it needs your battery to turn the starter on to start the engine. But as soon as the engine is running, the engine is no longer using the battery as a power source. It is actually taking electricity that it is producing and putting it to the battery. It needs the battery to be in the system, because if it doesn't have the battery, it's disconnecting it from the loop and you have a problem because it's disconnected. The battery has to be in the system, but the engine is not consuming power from the battery. That's important, because if we look at the back of this battery switch, hey, real quick, if you like this kind of information, you should check out our school community in the link in the description, as well as the pinned comment below. And I hook up the meter to the battery switch. We flip this over, it's on off. We have no continuity on here. If I switch this to the 1 position, the 2 position, you'll notice we have straight continuity. There's no disconnect. If I take this switch and I move it over, watch here to see if anything changes. You notice how nothing changed when I switch this back and forth? There's no issue here. You can go back and forth and it stays connected. So if you were to take your battery switch with your engine running, you notice I'm just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and nothing is changing on the meter. We are not losing connectivity between the engine and the battery. This is important because you notice that the battery switch, regardless of it being in the both position or the 2 position, it never loses continuity. So you can go back and forth all day long, and it's not going to lose connectivity between your engine and your battery. So again, the engine is not consuming power from the battery, it's actually giving power to it. And so the engine, it's not going to affect the engine at all. Now, the reason that you shouldn't do that though, because if there is a problem with your switch, and let's say that it goes off, you just lost connectivity with the battery, which can create a voltage spike on your engine. This can burn up your alternator, your voltage regulator, or other components that are on the charging system and the ignition system of your engine. It could do a voltage spike and mess up the computer on the engine, which is a very expensive component. That is why you do not really want to do that. Another reason is that you shouldn't have to do that. There's no reason to do something like that. You are doing something that you don't need to do. It's like, why risk creating a problem that you don't need to do? Whenever you start your engine and you're going to be running it for a long time, just go to the both position and start the engine, so that way, you're starting from both batteries, but then the engine's running and it's running on all, you're charging both of your batteries. Then whenever you get where you're going and you're going to shut it off, you can just shut your engine off, turn it to whatever battery you want your house to pull power from. So it will only be pulling power from your house battery. And then when you go to start your engine, you can turn it over to the both position, start your engine, because it'll have enough power from the other battery, and then boom, now you're charging this battery back up when you're running back wherever you're going. But also, this is going to depend on how your setup is set up, because you can have multiple different setups with your battery switches and parallel switches and automatic charge relays. So it's not a end all be all type of situation, but at least you have a very good understanding now of how this is actually working, and that the real risk is disconnecting the engine from the battery, because as soon as you do that, you are running the risk of having a problem, because you can create voltage spikes and other things that can burn up the components that are on the engine, or tear up the computer, or blow fuses, or different situations that can happen that are not worth the risk. And just because you can do something, meaning going from the both position to the 2 or both position to the 1, doesn't mean that you should do it. 9 times out of 10, nothing's gonna happen, but there is that off chance that your boat has a different setup and it does have a problem, and now all of a sudden you've got a whole nother problem because you messed up your engine because you're just playing with a switch doing something that you didn't need to do. I think the key takeaway is that, one, the switch should have continuity all the way. But if battery switch fails, they fail all the time, and you don't want it to fail while you're turning it around, having your engine running. And the other thing that I hope that you understand now is that the engine does not need the battery for it to run. It needs it to be in the system, but the engine's not consuming any power from the battery. The engine is producing all the power that it needs to consume, which is kind of why you get into different things whenever people are thinking about, you know, if you got a dead battery, how much power are you consuming and how much power is your engine producing? Because at idle, different engines don't produce what they produce at wide open throttle. So one engine might produce, let's say, 20 amps at idle, and at wide open throttle it produces 50 amps, but you have to account for the 6-7 amps that the engine is consuming. So if that stator is producing 50 amps and you're consuming 6 to 7 amps on the engine, you're really only getting like 52, 53, 54 amps going to your battery. And if you've got a big stereo, you've got multiple MFDs, you got a 1K transducer, subwoofer, all the speakers, all the lights, your live wells are going all the time, like you could be consuming enough power to where at idle you're consuming more from the battery than the engine is producing, and that's what's messing up your batteries. So lots of different things to think about. I hope I was able to explain that situation a little bit better so you kind of understand what happens when you turn your battery switch with the engine running between the positions, and that the main one is that you do not turn it to the off position. 9 times out of 10, if you go from 1 to all, nothing's going to happen, but if you turn it to the off position, that's a risk that you shouldn't be doing.